The sun sank behind the pines like a dropped coin, leaving the forest to hiss and murmur on its own. The town's lights flickered awake in the distance, but out here, the only glow came from the windows of the birch small cabin, warped by rain, and the gleam of a lone, stubborn street lamp a mile away. It did little good for what had happened and nothing for what might come. A girl was supposed to come home at dusk. A girl named Lila, with hair the color of chestnut bark and a laugh that sounded like coins spilling from a jar. She had wandered into the woods earlier to chase something she'd only believed in from stories. An impossible thing that might have been a trick of the wind or a memory made solid by fear. When the sun tipped into orange and then bled away, she did not come back. Her parents, Mara and John Birch, had searched the yard, the edge of the trees, the creek, where the water ran thin and cold enough to take courage away from a person. They found nothing but the quiet of a night that seemed to lean closer, listening. The town's sheriff came, tall and gray-eyed, but he found only tracks that stopped abruptly as if someone or something had stepped off the path and dissolved into the roots. By morning, the forest had reclaimed its narrative. In the place where Lila should have stood, there was a doll. It was not a child's doll, precisely. It carried the pale, waxy face of a girl long dead in the sense that a porcelain smile can suggest the living without giving it away. The doll's eyes, glassy and unblinking, were a deep, unsettling blue, like the sea just before a storm, the kind that reflects your fear back at you with a perfect patient gravity. Its dress was tattered, a faded pink that could have once been a ribbon or a bouquet, now torn and worn by wind, rain, and time. Mara picked it up with both hands, careful as one would cradle a bird that could not fly. The doll's head tilted, the seam at its neck whispering a sigh that wasn't a sigh and yet sounded like it. The birch house creaked with a wind that did not come from outside, but from inside the walls, as if the house itself were holding its breath. "Lila," Mara whispered, though she knew there was no longer any reason to call a name that could be heard in the hollowness of wood, but never again in a mouth that spoke back. That night, sleep visited them not with the mercy of rest, but with the pressure of a memory that refused to fade. In the early hours, when the forest exhaled a fog that smelled like rain and rust, the doll's eyes shifted. They did not move aggressively, not in the way a living thing might. Instead, they drifted, a slow turning, as if the doll were listening to a distant clock tick away the seconds of a life it claimed to own. The next morning, Mara saw the doll again where it had been left, the doorway to the living room, perched upright on a chair with the sun spilling across its face in a gentle, terrifying way. She blinked, and the doll's head did not blink back. It merely watched, a pale sentinel. That evening, John found the doll in the kitchen, its hands folded in a position that suggested prayer or a ritual of some private, unthinkable meaning. The silhouette of the kitchen was a stage, and the doll was the only actor who did not pretend to be human. Its mouth bore a faint line that could be a smile or the risk of a scream held just before release. "What did you do with Lila?" Mara whispered to the air, to the room, to the table that bore the marks of a family dinner long paused. The house had started to feel as if it remembered Lila in a way no one could quite articulate, like a memory that kept its own hours. The doll's voice did not come as a scream or a whisper. It came as a gentle, deliberate presence, as though someone unseen had learned to move without touching the floor. It spoke in a cadence that felt both old and new, like a lullaby sung by an echo. "I am Lila," the doll said, not with a mouth, but with a resonance that spiraled into Mara's chest and pressed outward, a quiet pressure that could either soothe or crush. The air grew thick with the scent of old paper and rain, of a long-closed attic smelling of mothballs and secrets. The parents did not rush to believe it, not yet, because belief requires a certain kind of courage that hunger, fear, and hope do not grant easily. Yet the words, the cadence, the recognition began to weave their way through Mara and John like a thread finding a seam. That night, the house changed. The walls breathed, the floorboards sighed. And the clock, the one that hadn't worked since Lila was a toddler, clicked into life with a soft, wet sound that belonged to something alive. Something that remembered every hour of the day with a precision that felt almost holy. In the attic, Mara found a trunk she did not remember seeing before. It was a small chest, carved with vines and birds, the kind of thing an elder relative might have kept for generations. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in a cloth stained with something that looked like rust and rain. The bundle unfolded to reveal a second doll, identical in every way to the first, except that this one wore a defiant expression, the kind of expression a child might shoot at a monster while declaring at a monster back. But there was more. Beneath the cloth lay a bundle of letters yellowed with age that spoke of the daughter who had been lost long before. A girl named Leela who had vanished into the woods years ago, and of a parent's pact to keep a fragment of her alive, to bind a part of her soul to a toy, to a ritual that would require a price. The letters described a house of wood and a farce that never forgot a name. They spoke of a night when a storm whipped the trees into a frenzy and the ground opened a little as if a mouth were yawning beneath the soil. The child, the letter explained, had not died. She had learned to survive by following the forest's oldest rule, to imitate life until life could imitate her back. The revelation did not come as a relief. It came as a different kind of weight, a gravity that pressed the ribs and counted the breath in each chest cavity as if it were counting the number of times a heart could beat and still be asked to endure more. The doll, with the defiant expression, Lila, perhaps, emerged from the attic like a spark of life caught in a storm. She stepped from the trunk as if the trunk had always anticipated her leaving, as if it waited for this exact moment to deliver what words could not. Her skin carried the faint gloss of porcelain, not because she had never aged, but because the ritual that bound her had kept her in a state between the living and the remembered. "Mama," she said, her voice a careful tremor, the way a branch might tremble when a heavier wind tests its strength. The sound did not come from her mouth alone. It came from the air around them, from the space between parent and child, where tenderness is sometimes the sharpest blade. Mara stepped toward her. "Lila, is it really you? Are you hurt? What happened out there?" Lila's eyes met hers, a gaze that carried years of absence and a few moments of revelation. "I am here, but I'm not the you remember. Not exactly. The wood kept me safe in a way you could never understand. It kept me alive by teaching me to listen, to mimic, to wait for the return of the breath you give me." John, who had always believed in the practical, the measurable, the finite, felt the world tilt on its axis. If you're Lila, then who is the girl we've been living with all these years? The girl who laughed in her sleep, who ran her toy car across the floor, who cried when the lights went out. The doll's lips did not move as it spoke, but the room heard it as if a window had opened to a different time, a different memory. I am both. I am the echo that survived when the forest decided who would be allowed to stay and who would be allowed to leave. I learned to be two things at once, the daughter you missed and the thing you forgot to fear, the forest, which had once seemed a vague backdrop to a human drama, began to intrude more intimately. The walls of the birch cabin shifted with the wind that seeped through the cracks, and the air carried the scent of pine needles and rain and something older, something that tasted of blood and old earth. The house seemed to listen to the forest now, answering it with creaks and sighs that sounded almost like a language. Mara asked a question that felt both absurd and necessary, a bridge across an invisible chasm. If you are Layla, where have you been all this time? Why did you leave us? The doll, Lila, took a step closer, and the room's temperature dropped as if the fireplace had exhaled cold air directly into their faces. I learned to walk in the dark between sleep and wakefulness. The forest kept me here, but not here where you can touch me. It kept me here where I could learn to hide in plain sight, to wear your memories like a coat, a weathered log in the hearth. Previously dull and useless began to glow with a faint ember. The flame did not leap. It simply warmed the space with a patient, watchful heat, as if it were listening for something to say and then deciding not to interrupt. The letters, read aloud by Mara in a tremor of fear and longing, spoke of a pact that allowed the forest to borrow a child's echo in exchange for the ability to keep her alive in a form that could endure the world's harshness. It was a pact made with something older than memory, something that did not forgive easily. The forest claimed me not because you abandoned me, Layla inside the doll explained, but because it needed a guardian. The words hung in the room, heavy as a quilt that had been stitched with fear and care. The parents stood at the brink of a decision that would either fracture their family beyond repair or force them to redefine life itself. If Lila truly lived in some sense as a doll that could speak and think and feel, then what did that do to the girl who vanished into the trees? Could two Laylas exist in the same world without tearing a hole in the fabric of their reality? John spoke, his voice a stubborn knot of love and protectiveness. We can't pretend this is normal. We can't pretend you're not wearing a face that isn't your own. But if this is really you, then we want you here with us. On our terms, in honesty, in danger if necessary. Lila, the real living memory of her mother and father, nodded slightly, the motion almost imperceptible, as if any more movement might break something essential. The doll's mouth curled into a quiet, unsettling smile that seemed to say that truth was a blade with two edges, one to cut away fear, the other to cut away hope. That night, Mara spoke to the forest in a whisper that carried through the trees like a patient prayer. She asked for guidance, for a way to keep both versions of her daughter safe, for a future that did not demand a choice between life and memory. The forest answered in the only language it knew, through signs, through omens, through the way the wind moved the leaves to form letters no one could read but everyone could feel. What followed was not a dramatic exodus or a final, conclusive showdown with some unseen horror. It was instead a slow, creeping reconciliation between two truths: that a child can be lost and found in different ways, and that a house with a heart can beat in rhythms that are not human. The doll remained in the living room, a silent sentinel with a gaze that drifted toward the windows, as if guarding against something and inviting something else in at the same time. Leela moved with a careful grace that suggested both a careful adaptation to a world she could never fully inhabit and a stubborn longing to belong to the people who carried her within their heartbeat. Mara and John learned to share their daughter not as a single fragile entity, but as a fragile, evolving partnership with a memory that refused to be left behind. They learned to listen to the house, to the forest, to the sound of a clock that ticked not in seconds, but in the slow, inexorable press of time upon a family that had been split and then gently braided back together. The woods, for their part, did not release their grip easily. They kept the scent of pine and rain in the air, the sense that eyes watched from the thicket, that a presence lingered just out of sight, patient and enduring. It was enough to remind them that fear, when faced with a truth this stubborn, can become a kind of quiet courage. And so they lived, not perfectly, not without another shudder in the night, when the doll's eyes seemed to glimmer with a remembered mischief, but with a new kind of honesty, a life in which a girl could exist as both a memory and a breath, a warning and a promise, a daughter who walked in two forms and still found a way to come home. The story did not end with a tidy bow. It ended with a choice that the Birch family would carry forward every day in the soft, frightened, hopeful ways families endure when they discover that the line between the living and the loved can blur, and that sometimes the most monstrous thing in the woods is the ache of a heart that refuses to let go. And if you listen closely on quiet evenings, you can hear the sound of a small wooden footstep in the hall, the soft rustle of a dress that has learned to live in both worlds, and the distant, patient murmur of a forest that keeps its promises in ways that only the brave can understand. The doll sits in the living room, a reminder and a warning, and every once in a while, when the wind ticks the house like a clock, you can almost hear Lila's voice, a whisper of weathered wood and something more. A girl who is alive, who has learned to stay